All right, welcome back, everybody. This is going to be lecture two, but we're going to jump straight to chapter 37. And we're going to talk about Paths of Economic and Political Development by Darren Osamoglu and James Robinson, who are very famous democratization scholars. Okay, so we're going to jump straight to part two, a theoretical framework. And they break down some basic assumptions of their theory. And the first assumption is that economic institutions matter for growth because they shape the incentives of the key actors in society, generally the elites. Part of this is that economic institutions are the major source for cross-country variation in growth and prosperity. So that's just a point they want to make. And that economic institutions also determine the spread of wealth in a society. Okay, so their second point is that economic institutions are endogenous and that they are basically a function of the collective society, right? The society determines what the economic institutions look like. Again, generally the elites, and these decisions are contentious, right? The people at the bottom are going to want the economic institutions to look very different from the people at the top, especially if there's high levels of inequality in the society. And those with the most power are generally going to be the ones who guide what political and economic institutions look like. Okay, so point three. These institutions are often inefficient, and we still have things like, poverty and homelessness and wild, income distributions. The United States is one of the most, unequal places on earth. We have the most wildly, exorbitantly rich people on the planet, and we have destitute poverty. And so you're going to have major contention on these issues. The reason that these inequalities tend to exist is, their assumption is that the elites just can't help themselves, and they have to try to restructure the economic institutions to benefit themselves. Point four is that de jure political factor comes from political institutions, right? This is, de jure means by law. And so the institutional power of the state is the de jure power. But there's also de facto power. And this generally comes from either the wealthy or it comes from the mass citizenry by overcoming collective action problems and using their sort of numbers through revolts, co-opting the military, protesting, all of those sorts of things. Okay. So why are institutions particularly persistent, right? Institutions are hard to change. And they say there's really two reasons for this, right? One is that these institutions are just really durable, right? The people who created them want to keep them going. And you generally need a sort of a shock to the system to change them, right? So either like a coup or a transition to a different type of government, or like the Great Depression in America, led to major changes in political and economic institutions. The second reason why these institutions are very persistent is that the rich use their power their de facto power, to try and influence these institutions to benefit them over time, and this perpetuates the economic inequality in the society. Okay. This leads naturally to the question, why do these governments set up these inefficient systems, right? And they give two examples. One, Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe. Robert Mugabe was basically against the white landowners, and he sort of expropriated all of their land. It led to the collapse of their political and economic system. They got high inflation. People didn't really know how to run the farms anymore or manage them, and so it became a huge issue. And the reason why I'm sorry. the reason why these governments there's a commitment problem here, right? Why can't you just make promises to your citizenry to try and quell revolution, right? And so they give another example here of sort of Middle Age property rights. And during the Middle Ages, a lot of kings would pay lip service basically to property rights for noble landowners. But when it came down to it, and sort of the kings or the monarchs were in debt to, say, another government or, say, the Catholic Church, then they would sort of expropriate the land and tax their nobles regardless of their former promises, right? And this is the problem in modern day society, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but it would have been economically efficient and much more profitable for the country overall if the king had extended actual property rights, but they sort of couldn't give up their power to tax and seek rent, right? And so in England, this led to the Glorious Revolution of 1688 and the overthrow of King James, which they'll talk about later in the book in the sort of case study, right? But the credible commitment is unbelievable, right? The citizenry thinks they have this small moment in time to make a change. And so even though the king or an autocratic leader promises, change, the worry is that they'll just renege, right? So they have to make a credible commitment. They have to have some skin in the game, and this often means transitioning to democracy. So part 3 is a theory of democracy. Their basic definition of democracy is a situation of relative political equality, right? In autocracies, it should be pointed out that elites hold all the de jure power. The citizens can have de facto power, some, and the wealthy can have some de facto power, but the state, or basically the political elites, hold all the de jure power in the society. When citizens do have de facto power and they think they can overthrow their government, they have this moment, right? They have now, and there's concern that there won't be this possibility in the future. And so this leads to a couple of questions. Why don't the elites simply give the citizens what they want to forestall revolution? We talked a little bit about this. The elites would likely just renege in the future when they thought that the political situation looked better for them. And so because there's this concern about the citizenry's de facto power sort of being lost in the future, the moment is now, and because you're not making a credible commitment to changing the society, we're going to have a revolution, right? And so the only real credible commitment for an autocrat to make is to hand over the power to a democracy and the citizens. And then second, why don't the elites just repress the citizens, right? We see a lot of this in African nations. We see this in Argentina in the 1960s and 1970s, where they disappeared thousands of citizens. You see this in Russia. Alexei Navalny recently died in prison for being sort of an outspoken critic of Vladimir Putin. South Africa, they committed sort of, militaristic acts of atrocity against their black citizens during their sort of regime of apartheid that led all the way up to the 1990s. So some of these repression acts can work, but they don't always, right? And it can be very costly in lives and in money. A good example would be Colombia from like the 1960s to the 2010s, basically, for like 50, 60 years. Colombia fought against sort of political terrorist drug organizations, sort of all rolled into one. The most famous was called FARC, sort of a narco-political group. But Colombia decided to fight them, and it lasted 60 years until they finally came to some sort of agreement, and it cost them, billions and billions of dollars in infrastructure and in architecture and in lives lost. And I mean, it was devastating, and it crippled their economy. And so it can be very costly. Another reason the elites sometimes don't just repress the citizens is it can cause the international uproar, right? So we saw this with South Africa with their apartheid regime. The Reagan administration backed the apartheid regime, but then when Bush and Clinton took over, they were very, very against apartheid, and much of the rest of the developed world turned against South Africa. Repression can also fail, right? And then the elites oftentimes are killed. So you saw that with Ceausescu, where if it does come down to revolution, oftentimes the leaders are just murdered, or they have to sort of self-exile and flee their country. And then finally, the military can actually be an adversary of the elites. So this is what you saw in South America, in Brazil, in sort of the 1950s and 60s, where the military would simply take over the autocracy because they didn't think it was being run well. And so for all these problems, there are times when it's just not favorable to repress. And so their basic thesis here is that when commitments are not credible and repression is too costly, we should see a transition to democracy. Okay, so they move on to part 4, which is called comparative statics. And they ask a couple of questions here, which we'll go through. The first, how do we build good economic institutions that are good for everyone in the society? And they say first is you have to have checks on elites' power so they can't capture the state. You need political power to be held by a large group of people, right? It can't just be centered on one person or a small, oligarchy. It has to be spread out. And you have to have a large section of your society with significant investment interests in your country, because that will increase the likelihood that your economic systems stay sort of fair and stable. And then you need a lack of rents. So rents means you can sort of take from your society, either the state or from individuals. So slavery is sort of an individual rent. So you see a lot of this in agrarian societies. But then you also have oil and resource rents. So a good example would be like Saudi Arabia has really no interest in pleasing their citizens because they can just extract, exorbitant wealth from the state through oil. The Democratic Republic of Congo would be another one where the leaders basically just extract wealth from gold and diamond mines, and their society is just left crippled. There's no, Ebola is rampant. There's no real public health system. There's no real roads. It's very, very sort of undeveloped nation. There's a lot of civil war and things of that sort. So they actually, a lot of scientists call it the resource curse, where if you want good governance and good economic institutions, you need to have few resources that elites can extract from your society. Their next question is, how do we build good democratic institutions, not just economic institutions? The first point they make is that there needs to be general equality before the law so that elites and regular citizens can be held to the same standards. There needs to be a distribution of power away from the elites. And so, the voting mechanism and suffrage and actual competitiveness in your elections, these sorts of things. And 3, they suggest that both bad economic and political institutions are largely due to elite capture. And so we should see a co-evolution of good economic and good political institutions. Okay, then they move on to how do we balance de facto power, right? So that one small group of the citizenry or the wealthy don't capture the state. And so their first suggestion is low inequality. This will give all citizens more resources to sort of investigate and understand politics, to get involved with political groups, to pressure their government, right? You need checks on power. So this not only reduces the elite's ability to sort of capture the state or the economic or political institutions, but it also reduces the possibility that the citizens can sort of threaten the elites, right? Then you need investment opportunities for a broad swath of your society. Again, this makes building good economic institutions easier because it incentivizes a free and fair market. And then you need limited rents available. And then finally, I want to just close with their thesis. Their thesis states, it's at the very end of part 4 before their case study. And it states that our framework suggests that the level of per capita income and its rate of growth and the extent of democracy are jointly determined as part of a political economic equilibrium. So these things co-evolve, right? Good economic institutions and good political institutions co-evolve together. And they say our framework suggests that because democracy, other things being equal, redistributes political power to the mass of people with an interest in broad-based property rights, it ought to be good for prosperity. So these things co-evolve, but then they also finally make this point that it's not that per capita income has never really been found to actually drive democratization, right? It's not causative. They co-evolve together. Okay, so that's it. I'm going to leave you to read the case study. It's really interesting stuff on the history of England from about the mid-17th century to about the early 20th century. It talks about the distribution of power between sort of the elites and the landed gentry, and some of the acts that changed things. So interesting case study. So read that carefully, and have a great day.